Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the final academic event of the John Marshall International Center for the Study of Statesmanship at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. We are most gratified tonight together to hear Paul Cantor speak to us about Shakespeare and the Roman regime. Professor Cantor, as many of you may know, is the Clifton Barrett Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He's written widely in Shakespeare and Renaissance literature. He is also published widely on pop culture. In fact, his book, Gilligan Unbound, yes, that Gilligan, Pop Culture in the Age of Globalization, was named one of the best books of nonfiction for 2001 by the Los Angeles Times. If you have not read his book on Shakespeare and Rome, it's magnificent. It was your dissertation, if I'm not mistaken, is that right? Yes. It's all right. Well done. Anyway, if you would, it would be a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Professor Cantor will speak and then take some questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. This lecture is coordinated with a seminar that's going to be taking place tomorrow and Saturday. How many of you are from the seminar? Okay, and the rest of you are not. All right, I'm going to give a somewhat more general lecture than I planned. I was going to go into very great detail on Roman history and politics, and I'm guessing most of you are here about Shakespeare, right? So I will shift the lecture somewhat. We'll get some of Rome in as well. Anyway, Rome is a very important subject for Shakespeare, one of the most important, evidently, in his thinking. If you just look at his tragedies, he wrote 10 of them. 4 of them are set in ancient Rome: Titus Andronicus, an early play that I'm going to tend to dismiss, and then the ones we're going to be doing in the seminar: Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra. So that's 4 out of his 10 tragedies are about ancient Rome. If you turn to his last plays, one of the very last plays he wrote, Cymbeline, is set in Roman Britain. You turn to his comedies, probably the very first comedy he wrote, the Comedy of Errors, is actually based on a Roman play, the Menechmi by Plautus, and he shows the influence of Roman drama a great deal. And if you look at his history plays, he's very aware of the Roman past of Britain. So that, for example, in Richard III, when the young princes see the Tower of London, where, alas, they are soon to be murdered, they note that Julius Caesar built that place. And indeed, the shadow of Rome seems to haunt Shakespeare's Britain in Henry V, in the prologue to Act 5, when Henry V is returning, the great victor, from the Battle of Agincourt. His entrance to London is compared to a Roman triumph. The sort of thing that Julius Caesar celebrated. So wherever you look in Shakespeare, you see the presence of Rome, and in fact, he has a strong sense that Britain was once a Roman colony. So he's constantly making connections between Britain and Rome, and that's a good clue to see that when Shakespeare tried to understand Britain and British history, he was thinking in terms of Rome, and there was good reason for that. Rome loomed very large in the European imagination in Shakespeare's day. It still looms large in our imagination. People are still fascinated by Rome. When I look, I'm an addict of the History Channel, and by my count, the 3 most important subjects they have are Hitler, Rome, and Egypt, perhaps in that order. But it shows you we still marvel at the great Roman architecture, and Roman literature is still influential. However important it looks to us, though, it looked even far more important in the days of the Renaissance. Roman architecture was more conspicuous. Think of Hadrian's Wall in England to this day. Roman architectural achievements looked unsurpassable. The Renaissance was just catching up with Roman architecture. I think the dome of the Florence Cathedral was the first modern dome that could even aspire to equal the dome of the Pantheon. And so the people in Shakespeare's day marveled at the Roman achievement in every way. Roman literature loomed vast on the horizon. For example, Virgil's Aeneid, that was the great epic for Shakespeare. Homer was just being rediscovered in English in Shakespeare's day. It was just being translated into English. Greek literature, Shakespeare, for example, knew Roman drama rather well, did not know Greek drama, as far as we can tell, at all. Roman medicine was still the foundation for medical treatment. I've been told by a friend whose hobby is plumbing that our modern plumbing did not reach the Roman standards of plumbing till approximately the 1930s. Short of electricity, the Romans pretty much had it all. And so people look back at them amazed. I mean, we're still amazed at their achievement. But there are so many areas in which we can say we surpassed them. The Romans never got to the moon. The Romans, never had iPods. But for the Renaissance, there were very few achievements they'd reached that looked better than what Rome had done. And above all, they looked at the fact that Rome had conquered the world. They were very aware of what had constituted the Roman Empire, and it was larger than any political unit in Europe in Shakespeare's day. There was this fiction of the Holy Roman Empire, which shows you that they were trying to rival Rome, but in fact they couldn't, and they wondered, how did these Romans do all these great things? And above all, how did they do these great political things? And when you thought politics in Shakespeare's day, you thought Rome. And, my argument would be that Shakespeare was very interested in politics, that his plays center on political questions, and therefore, in some ways, they center on Rome for him. If you want to understand political achievement, you have to look at Rome and these great Romans like Julius Caesar, whose conquest seemed unsurpassed. Now, what does Rome mean? You can look in our imagination to get some sense of what Rome means to us. And in fact, if you just look at our popular culture, you'll see we're carrying around some contradictory images of Rome in our mind. I'll show you in a minute they're not contradictory, but first it seems odd because on the one hand we think of Rome as this great austere, disciplined, noble community, and then we think of Rome as the very definition of debauchery, orgies. And you just have to watch something like the HBO series Rome or movie like Gladiator, and still it's amazing how much a role. Oh, we've got Spartacus now on one of the cable channels. And on the one hand, when we think of Rome, we think something like Sparta. That is, we think of this great, disciplined military community with its unconquerable armies, its incredibly loyal, devoted, disciplined troops, able to make long, fantastically long marches and to fight anybody and defeat them. We think of stoicism and nobility and men of great dignity and of patriotism, all these wonderful things. Again, it's the reason our banks look Roman or our government buildings, we still try to make them look Roman because our image of Rome is of political stability. On the other hand, there are those orgies. We have all those images of decadent Roman emperors down on the Mediterranean in barges, indulging themselves. And, I won't go into the details, but when you think about it, it's very contradictory that we think of the Romans as our image of discipline and our image of excess. Well, in fact, it's not so contradictory because Rome had a long history and it changed a lot in the course of that history. And what we're really talking about in these two images are the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And as I'm going to try to show, Shakespeare's very aware of that difference. So the Roman Republic, which lasted roughly from about 500 BC to, sort of the year zero, maybe 31 BC. Long time, 450 years plus. And then you have the empire, as you can say, runs maybe to, again, another 500 years, maybe 476 AD. Then the whole thing switches to Byzantium in the east. But in any case, you got two entities here, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, both of which lasted for about 450 years, let's say, but represent a major change. In fact, the great turning point in Roman history is the switch from the Republic to the Empire, which again occurs around the time of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, the man who ends up converting Rome from a republic to an empire, and the first emperor being Octavius, Julius Caesar's nephew and his heir, who became Augustus Caesar, the first emperor. And there are some continuities between the Republic and the Empire, but basically when we're talking the Republic, we are talking the great Rome of patriotism and the great armies and the discipline. And it's the emperors who represent the decadence and the orgies. Again, this is very much Shakespeare's view of Rome. And indeed, when you look at his plays, you see that he seems to have distributed them precisely to explore this issue of Republic versus Empire in Roman history. It's the same issue as in Star Wars as well. This pattern of going from a noble republic to a corrupt empire, it really has made a deep impression on the Western consciousness. So let me say one thing about Shakespeare's knowledge of Rome, first of all, because it's really my claim that he understood Rome profoundly. Really understood Roman politics and, for example, what the difference between the Republic and the Empire was. But beyond that, he in fact gets a lot of the details right. He seems to have a very solid knowledge of Roman history. Now, there are many people who deny that, because you will find some anachronisms in Shakespeare's plays. His Roman plebeians throw their caps up in the air to celebrate Caesar's triumph. English poor people wear caps. Romans did not wear caps. Picky historians note things like this. Or there's a clock that rings in Julius Caesar. Of course, Roman clocks were water clocks, and they didn't have alarm bells. And there's reference to the circulation of the blood in one of the Roman plays. That would be there are several anachronisms, but really a remarkably small number of them, contrasted with real knowledge, for example, of just the physical geography of the city of Rome. I mean, Shakespeare knows about the Tarpeian Rock and what the relation of the capital to the Forum is and that sort of thing. So in fact, I claim, and really was in a minority of one when I published this book on Shakespeare's Rome in 1976, that Shakespeare's Romans are really Romans. For a long time, there was this claim that they're just Englishmen in disguise. And very distinguished people had claimed that. Samuel Johnson, the great English critic, had argued that. Goethe, the great German author, had argued that. These were people who were trying to show that, yes, Shakespeare's Romans, they fall in love, they get into quarrels. I mean, there's something very human about them, and in that sense, universal. But I think these people were very wrong not to see that Shakespeare was trying to portray a distinct breed in his Romans. And there he really had a lot to draw upon, and above all, Plutarch. Shakespeare's great source of knowledge about Rome was obviously Plutarch's lives. Plutarch was a captive Greek who wrote in Greek about both Greek and Roman history, and wrote this famous work, The Parallel Lives, in which he set out to pair great Romans with great Greeks, largely to the favor of the Greeks. For example, his life of Coriolanus is paired with the life of Alcibiades. Both men famously traitors to their cities, remarkable men who were able to change sides in war. And it's clear that Shakespeare read Plutarch. He actually lifts whole passages from Plutarch in these Roman plays. He was working in a translation by Thomas North. He did not read the original Greek. We can see that he used the North translation because, for example, in the description of Cleopatra's barge, I mean, much of the language comes straight out of Plutarch, and the incidents come out of Plutarch. So we do know that Shakespeare read Plutarch very, very carefully. What else he knew is a little hard to say. It is likely that he read some of Livy, the great Latin historian of Rome. Shakespeare never went to college, but then again, an Elizabethan high school, if I may be allowed to say so, was better than most of our colleges today, at least in terms of languages. Ben Jonson famously said of Shakespeare, he knew little Latin and less Greek. Well, Ben Jonson was one of the great classical scholars of his day. So what he's saying is, by comparison to me, the great Ben, Shakespeare knows little Latin and less Greek, but notice he knows at least a little Latin, and he even knows some Greek. Now, in fact, people have studied the curriculum of the kind of high school that Shakespeare went to in Stratford. The building's still there. We know about the building, about the school. And yeah, they read Ovid in Latin, they read Livy in Latin, so probably he was quite able to read Latin. There's no smoking gun, as there is with Plutarch, that Shakespeare had read Livy, but he may have been familiar. For example, it looks as if he knew Cicero's Philippics, which were speeches that Cicero gave attacking Mark Antony, because there were descriptions of Mark Antony in there that seemed to fit particularly Mark Antony's speech over Caesar's body. So again, I'm not saying that Shakespeare was a great scholar of ancient Rome, but he knew more about it than the average person today does. And the other thing, I believe that he had read Machiavelli. I'm not alone in this. It's very difficult to prove, but I believe he read Machiavelli's Discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, which was the most important treatise on ancient Rome in the Renaissance. There's very strong evidence that it was circulating in the English translation, unpublished, but circulating in manuscript in Shakespeare's day. In any case, Shakespeare may well have read Italian. There are some signs of that in some of his work. But Shakespeare was probably very good at languages. I always point this out to people. He probably picked up languages very quickly. He had whatever the thing in the brain that deals with language, he probably had the biggest portion of the brain there than any human being who's ever lived. So we shouldn't underestimate his reading. And in a minute, I'm going to try to show you in what way he was influenced by the Discourses on Livy. But there are things he shows in his understanding of Rome that suggest to me strongly that he was familiar with Machiavelli. Possibly he discovered these things independently. He was a very smart guy. So he did know about Rome. And what attracted him to Rome? Why was he specifically interested in it? And there, I think, he really was interested in Rome as an alternative to Britain. Now, not claiming he wanted to lead a rebellion and turn England into Rome, or that he wanted to overthrow the British monarchy, or anything like that. I'm just saying that as an intellectual enterprise, I suspect he was very interested in Rome because it was a way of getting outside of the orbit of England. His history plays show that he was very interested in England and in English history, and very concerned trying to understand how the British monarchy operated. But as I think any intelligent person would, I think was also trying to say, well, what are the alternatives? And the great alternative to monarchy is republic. Certainly at that time, it seemed that way. And Rome was the great example of a republic, at least during its Republican era. a country that had not had a king for 450 to 500 years, roughly. And I think Shakespeare wanted to see how that worked. Now, there were some republics in Europe at the day. The major one was the Republic of Venice. Shakespeare is very interested in that. He wrote 2 plays, Othello and Merchant of Venice, in which he explores the nature of a modern republic, the Republic of Venice. All this suggests to me that he's looking around the world and see, again, not that he's necessarily rejecting England, but saying, well, what are the alternatives? What are the other ways of life that are available to human beings? And there, Rome, if you were interested in republics, Rome was the place. Because he was a republican form of government that had survived 450 years. Let me remind you that the United States form of government dates back only to 1789, and so a little bit over 200 years old. Not close to the length of time that the Roman regime existed. Now, what the republic meant above all was self-government, not necessarily in the sense of democracy, as I'll explain in a little while, but a republican people were people who somehow governed themselves, maybe not with democratic institutions, but it's the alternative to one-man rule. And the main thing that republican government represented was political participation. Monarchy means basically that one man rules and everybody is subject to that monarch. Republic means that with some set of institutions, whether democratic or not, possibly aristocratic, you have various groups and individuals who participate in the active political life of the community. And that what republicanism meant was people taking politics seriously, and politics being an important part of their life, maybe the most important part of their life, and political participation as taken as a sign of the main thing a human being was supposed to do. And that's what Romans meant to the Renaissance. Here was a community in which there was a very active involvement of the citizens in political life. That was tied with the sense that political life was very important, and maybe even the highest thing. Now, in Shakespeare's day, it was difficult to claim that politics was the highest thing because of Christianity. Christianity denies that politics is the highest thing in human life, and indeed has phrases like render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, with a strong sense that that's somehow lower, what is Caesar's, and that the higher things in life go beyond the political realm. And one of the things that I think Shakespeare is acutely aware of is the difference between the English regime, which occurs in a Christian context, and the Roman regime, which occurred in a pagan context. A good sign of that is the significance of suicide in Shakespeare's plays, and I would point to that as the strongest evidence of his awareness between modern Christian in his day and an ancient Roman. That is, Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. Or that this too solid flesh would melt thaw and resolve itself into dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Hamlet starts from the fact that he can't commit suicide, that his Christian religion forbids him to commit suicide. That's very defining of Christians in Shakespeare's sense. End of Hamlet, Horatio, notice the name, good old Roman name, comes forward and says, I am more an antique Roman than a Dane, by which he means I'm going to kill myself. I'm not going to stay around and tell your story. I want to die with you. And how does Shakespeare formulate that? I am more an antique Roman than a Dane. There's this very strong sense in Shakespeare, Romans commit suicide, Christians don't. Enter Julius Caesar, the characters are lining up to commit suicide. Because for Romans, that's a noble thing to do. For Christians, it's a sin. Again, this is a point. This is what I'd point to if someone says, "Oh, Shakespeare's Romans are just Elizabethan Englishmen in disguise." Elizabethan Englishmen don't proudly say, "I'm going to kill myself," but Shakespeare's Romans do. This is a very fundamental point. This is much more important than whether you wear caps or not. That I consider trivial. But on this real issue of what's your attitude towards suicide, Shakespeare very clearly sees the difference between a modern and a pagan, modern Christian in England, let's say, and a pagan Roman. So for him, exploring Rome was really exploring a different regime. And I use that word in my title for that reason. Regime is this interesting word that has the nice ambiguity that it refers to a form of government and a way of life. We can talk about a democratic regime, aristocratic regime, definitely a way of naming forms of government, but we also talk of, I'm going on a disciplined regime now. No more McDonald's shakes. I'm going on a disciplined regime. And Shakespeare is very interested in that correlation between forms of government and ways of life, and has this sense that a monarchic regime produces a certain kind of way of life in its people, and a Republican regime produces a certain kind of life. He's very interested in what way was that Republican regime different from a modern monarchical regime in a Christian context, and what kind of different people did it produce. Now here I'm going to suggest he had a little hint from Machiavelli. Again, I can't prove he read the Discourses, but I want to read you a passage from Book 2, Chapter 2 of Machiavelli's Discourses on Living. Here Machiavelli is talking about the difference between pagan Romans and modern Christians. He, let me point out, is writing in probably the second decade of the 16th century in a Christian community, and so he doesn't want to appear to be saying something too negative about Christianity, but let's see what he says. Thinking then whence it can arise that in those ancient times people were more lovers of freedom than in these. That's what he's really taught. They were Republicans. They loved to participate in politics. They didn't just want to be ordered around. That's what he means by lovers of freedom. I believe it arises from the same cause that makes men less strong now, which I believe is the difference between our education and the ancient, founded on the difference between our religion and the ancient. For our religion, by which he means Christianity, having shown the truth and the true way. Make sure he puts that in there. Keep them out of the fire. For our religion, having shown the truth and true way, makes us esteem less the honor of the world, whereas the Gentiles, the pagans, esteeming it very much, and having placed the highest good in it, were more ferocious in their actions. And now he's talking about why were the ancients such great warriors? Why did they care so much about politics? Well, they had this different religion. And he goes on and says, the ancient religion did not beatify men if they were not full of worldly glory, as were captains of armies and princes of republics. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men. So Christianity, celebrates the humble, the contemplative. This ancient Roman paganism celebrated the great captains and princes. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men. It has then placed the highest good in humility, abjectness, and contempt of things human. The other placed it in greatness of spirit, strength of body, and all other things capable of making men very strong. I'm sure that's più forte in the Italian. And if our religion asks that you have strength in yourself, it wishes you to be capable more of suffering than of doing something strong. This mode of life thus seems to have rendered the world weak and given it in prey to criminal men who can manage it securely, seeing that the collectivity of men, so as to go to paradise, think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them. It's a really amazing passage. And again, Machiavelli has covered himself by saying, well, Christianity is the true religion. He's saying many things that Christianity does, celebrating humility and so on. But the undercurrent here is this religion has enervated us. Italians, he's thinking, we used to be Romans. We're now Italians. What's the difference? Christianity. We're no longer strong. And the reason is we now have this idea of an afterlife, and we care more about that than this life. And so we don't strive so much in this world for glory, and we don't care about participating in politics, and the result is we have weak communities. Machiavelli was particularly concerned. There was no Italy in his day. There were all these little petty republics like Venice and Florence, that they were being overrun by the Spanish and the French and so on, and he was hoping to maybe reunite Italy and certainly revivify the Italian spirit by getting back some sense of the ancient Romanists. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily Shakespeare's view, but I think it points to why he was interested in ancient Rome, precisely because of this question. Ancient Romans were a different breed of human beings, and it's a product of a certain regime, a republican regime, and also of a certain religion which put its emphasis on this worldliness and not the otherworldliness. So I think Shakespeare was particularly attracted to the notion of the Roman Republic. Now there, we just have to look at the distribution of his Roman plays. Now I'm going to set aside Titus Andronicus. It's undoubtedly his worst tragedy. It's been offered as his worst play ever. It's a very young effort. I mean, some people try to incorporate into their view of Shakespeare's Rome. I don't, despite having made great efforts at it. I will say, since seeing the Julie Taymor movie of it, with Anthony Hopkins as Titus, my opinion of the play has gone up. Just reading it, I thought it was simply awful, but it actually works. And I've now seen it staged twice since then. Now everybody stages it using the movie as a template. And the play is better than I thought. But it's very early. It seems to be an effort to write a really Roman play that is modeled on Seneca's tragedies. It's set in a kind of Never Never Land. You cannot place the moment historically. It's sort of late Empire, but unlike the other three Roman tragedies, you can't date it precisely. So I am going to set it aside. In any case, well, if I had to fit it into my argument, it would be an example of the late decadence of the empire. But anyway, let's look at Shakespeare's three great Roman plays, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, and Cleopatra. In our seminar, we're going to do them in Roman historical chronological order, beginning with Coriolanus. But in terms of the chronology of Shakespeare's career, the first one of these plays he wrote was Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar quite simply deals with the transition from the Republic to the Empire. It's about the moment when Julius Caesar was on the verge of creating himself the first emperor of Rome, of bringing one-man rule to Rome and ending the Republic. And if you just look at the dialogue in the play, it's all about the Republic. That's what Brutus and Cassius care about. That's why they kill Caesar. They are trying to restore the Republic. The play simply turns on the issue of which Republic or Empire. And what people like Cassius so bitterly complain about is the loss of political participation in Rome, the fact that now this one man is everything. Cassius, is an old Republican Roman, can't brook that. So Shakespeare writes a Roman play, and it's about the crucial turning point when the Roman Republic began to transform into the Roman Empire. Then Julius Caesar's probably written around 1598, somewhere in there, and then very much at the end of his tragic phase, if you want to call it that. So around 1608, 1609, Shakespeare wrote Coriolanus and Cleopatra, and most people think they were the last two tragedies he wrote. And here it's curious. Antony and Cleopatra takes up as the sequel to Julius Caesar and deals with the emergence of the Roman Empire fully established. This is when that nephew of Julius Caesar, Octavius, eliminates his last great rival, Antony, the one remaining disputant for rule of Rome, and this is where Augustus Caesar, the first emperor, is going to come from triumphing over Antony at the Battle of Actium. Now, what's particularly interesting in light of what I've been saying is, if that's Shakespeare's image of the emergence of the empire, the decadence is there from the start. Antony and Cleopatra is all about decadence. It's all about orgies. It's all about banquets and drinking and getting drunk and passing out and revelry and staging plays. I mean, really quite extraordinary. At the end of Plutarch's life of Antony, he points out that his grandson was Nero. And that may have registered on Shakespeare because it's an extraordinarily strong image of the Roman Empire as decadent. At a point, it wasn't all that decadent yet. And in fact, Augustus is credited with having established a reasonably good system at first and having tried to restore some of the old Roman virtues. And it takes a while till we get to Caligula and then to Nero. And even after that, there are some good emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, who try to restore some of the old Roman dignity. But as if Shakespeare is saying, no, once you leave the Republic, that's it. That's it for the old Rome. The old Roman virtues are gone. You go straight into decadence. It's orgy city from then on. And characters within the play say that too. They are already looking back with a kind of nostalgia to the Republic and suggesting this is the end. Even at the end of Julius Caesar, this was the noblest Roman of them all, Mark Antony says of Brutus. And everyone's talking about the sun of Rome is set, and with the end of the Republic, it's all gone. And Shakespeare seems to think that, insofar as Antony and Cleopatra seems to offer in spades that notion of Roman decadence under imperial system. Now, at the same time, he's writing this play, Coriolanus, and in a way that's the linchpin to my argument about Shakespeare focusing on the issue of the Republican regime. Now, Julius Caesar is very famous, Mark Antony is very famous, Cleopatra is very famous, Octavius is very famous. There are many works written before Shakespeare on those subjects, many works on those subjects since. Coriolanus is in a way the odd man out in the Roman plays. He was famous. Plutarch wrote a life about him. Machiavelli discusses him very early in the Discourses. I think it's chapter 8 in book 1. But it's interesting, he's not that famous. He ain't Julius Caesar. And you don't see a lot after Shakespeare dealing with Coriolanus. There was one restoration play about Coriolanus in English. There's a German play about Coriolanus that Beethoven wrote an overture to. T.S. Eliot has a tiny little poem about Coriolanus. I mean, there are echoes of him. You occasionally see a painting of him, some French neoclassical painting of him. But this is not a story that attracts many people, many artists in any field, but it attracted Shakespeare. One of the 10 tragedies he wrote, one of the last tragedies he wrote, oddly enough, in Titus, there's a reference, in Titus Andronicus, there's a reference to Coriolanus, as if at the very beginning of Shakespeare's career, he's already thinking about this figure. And so I'm saying that it tells us a lot that Shakespeare chose to write that play, because that play, by dealing with Coriolanus, deals with the founding of the Roman Republic. That is the moment at which it was founded. That is to say, within the memory of the characters in that play, the Tarquin kings were expelled from Rome. Now, Rome was ruled by Etruscans. Ooh, they hated that. It was ruled by Etruscan kings for a period, especially this last dynasty, the Tarquins, and the famous story of the rape of Lucrece, which Shakespeare wrote a poem about. Tarquin the Proud rapes this Roman maiden, and the Romans get together and in response to her being dishonored and her committing suicide. As a result, they expel the Roman kings and create the Republic. And then for 450 years, they didn't have one-man rule, not until Julius Caesar. And it's actually an interesting sign. The name Rex, king, was so hated in Rome that even Julius Caesar chose not to have himself called Rex. You see that in Julius Caesar when he thrice refused the kingly crown. He was becoming all but king in Rome, but he didn't want the title because he knew how much the Romans hated the title. 450 years they hated that title. They remembered the last king they had raped a Roman maiden, and they never forgot that. And indeed, the Romans never had a Rex. In the Augustus had himself called Princeps, had himself called Caesar. But anyway, so we really see in Coriolanus the foundation of the Republic, and particularly the emergence of the most distinctive institution of the Roman Republic, the tribunate. That's what the issue is. It's interesting. The play begins with the people calling for grain, but they settle for having a kind of representative, these tribunes who were the last piece in the Roman regime, the way the people had a means of influencing Roman politics. So just if you sketch out these three plays, then we have Coriolanus, a play about the founding of the Republic. We have Antony and Cleopatra about the founding of the empire, how Augustus emerges from Octavius, and we have Julius Caesar, which deals with the transition from the Republic and empire. It suggests to me that Shakespeare was interested in the difference between the Republic and the empire, and that's actually the logic that governs his Roman plays. Now, the other interesting thing to think about is the extreme contrast between Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus. I first noticed this in the fact that nobody eats anything in Coriolanus, and there's just one banquet after another in Antony and Cleopatra. Coriolanus' mother gets angry one moment. She says, "Anger is my meat, I sup upon myself." People offer Coriolanus wine at one point. He says, nah, I'm too busy. You know, Antony's never too busy for a cup of wine. And in fact, those two plays really epitomize exactly those two contrasting images of Rome that I were talking about. Coriolanus is the epitome of the austere, disciplined, martial republic, where Rome was basically an armed camp, great city of soldiers and their generals, and Antony and Cleopatra again is the great Rome of orgies and decadence. As if Shakespeare really is correlating these very distinct ways of life with the different political regimes. And that's what my book, Shakespeare's Rome, is really about, exploring the contrast between the two plays and the contrast between the two regimes. And Shakespeare really, I think, does understand the political details and the human consequences of these different political arrangements. Now let me just say a little bit about the Roman regime. I was going to talk a lot more about it, but I'm glad I got to tell you a little bit more about Shakespeare here. But what made this Republican regime distinctive? Now, here there's a lot of political thinking in antiquity about this issue. You see it in Plato's Republic, you see it in Aristotle's Politics, you see it in a Greek who wrote a Roman history named Polybius, who wrote the most important description of the Roman Republican regime we have. It's in Book 6 of his histories. And the characteristic of the Roman regime was that it was a mixed regime. The ancients had already divided regimes into one-man rule, several-man rule, and everybody rules, that is to say, into monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But they had noted that all these regimes had problems, that monarchy easily devolved into tyranny when the monarch, or even more likely his son, started to get uppity. started to treat the community as his own possession. Monarchy always degenerated into tyranny. Aristocracy, they said, always degenerated into oligarchy. Again, aristocracy in Greek means rule of the best, and aristocrats were supposed to be noble people who really had a sense of the common good. But people noticed after a while they started becoming richer and richer and making the laws serve their own ends. And so aristocracy became oligarchy, and democracy was always becoming mob rule, as the ancients saw it, that again, people would throw out a king or throw out the aristocrats and try to rule justly in their own name. But after a while, there's a famous definition of democracy is 3 wolves and 1 sheep voting on what's for dinner. And so the majority would start to appropriate the goods of the minority. The ancients, again, you see this in Plato, you see it in Aristotle, were very concerned about the way these forms of government degenerated over time, and they came up with basically the idea of checks and balances, that the only regime that could last would be a mixed regime which had elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy all built into one regime in which they could balance each other's negative tendencies out. Now, Sparta was the great example of this in ancient thought, and Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta, was credited with his great wisdom for having set up a mixed regime. But with Polybius, we get the argument that Rome, the Roman Republic, was a mixed regime, and a rather interesting one because no one had planned it. That came into being over time as a result of various accidents. And Polybius's analysis is quite accurate, and I think Shakespeare adopts it, and it's at the heart of Coriolanus, and that is that Rome had monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic elements in its regime. The monarchic element was the consuls, C-O-N-S-U-L. Rome was ruled at any given moment in the Republican era, roughly 500 to 40 BC, ruled by 2 consuls who were essentially the generals of the armies. They were the executive element in the regime. They were very powerful because they led the armies into battles. They were sort of chief magistrates within the city as well and had other duties. But Rome was largely a military community, and so the most important thing was being commander-in-chief. And the Romans recognized, you see here, the need for some degree of executive authority. You got to have somebody in charge, especially of an army. But notice there's 2. And that was you start to see the genius of the regime right there. As long as you have 2 consuls, neither one of them can do too much on his own. They have to agree on certain things. They're always there to check each other. One guy doesn't have all the executive power. There's 2 of them. Moreover, they serve for only 1 year. And for a long time in Roman history, you couldn't succeed. They had term limits. You could become consul again after some period, but you couldn't be consuls 2 years in a row. So here was the idea. Yes, we need strong leaders, we need executive power, but we want a lot of them. We want 2 at once at a minimum, and we want a lot of people to have been consul. So no one can ever say to us, you can't do without me. We got a backlog of 8 consuls. That's what Coriolanus essentially says to Rome, is you can't do without me. And frankly, he's right, and that's a problem for Rome there. But anyway, you can see the genius of the Republican regime in the idea of turnover. 2 consuls always at one moment, and they don't last for another year, for more than 1 year. Then you have the Senate. The Senate was the aristocratic element in the Roman regime. It consisted traditionally of 300 men who were from the aristocratic families of Rome. They were the big landowners. They were the wealthy people, chiefly wealthy in terms of land, and they represented the element of stability, of wisdom in the regime. They were the people who had a real stake in things and who had a lot of experience, and that was the sort of aristocratic notion. They would contribute everything that good families could contribute to the stability of regime. And so that was the aristocratic element of the regime. And then the popular element was the people, the plebeians. You know, the senators were the patricians, common people were the plebeians. And they formed a popular assembly, and they had to in effect vote on the consuls. Again, you see that process happening in Coriolanus. The Senate would effectively nominate someone to be consul, and then the people had to ratify it. The people had the last say on going to war. Again, the Senate would say, let's go to war, but the people had to vote on it. And there were many things like that. In a capital crime, the people had to vote if a person was being sentenced to death. Again, that's something we see in Coriolanus when Coriolanus is proclaimed a traitor, and it's the people that condemn him to be thrown off the Tarpeian rock. So, as Polybius says, if you look at the consuls, you'd think Rome was a monarchy. If you look at the Senate, you'd think it was an aristocracy. And if you look at the power of the people, you would think it was a democracy. And that's what he liked about Rome. And what I think Shakespeare at least admires in the Roman Republic, that he was this system who had all the elements of rule, and they checked and balanced each other. A consul could only go so far. If he ever had any hopes of being re-elected consul, not immediately, but in the future, he couldn't alienate the people too much. Moreover, as we see in Coriolanus, he has to make certain promises to them before they'll ratify him, and so on. And so you have each element checking the other. Now, in fact, as Polybius says, and Machiavelli was aware, the Senate basically ruled Rome for this 450-year period, whatever, of the Republic. The Senate chose the consuls, and the consuls were almost always members of the Senate or from the patrician families. Every 100 years or so, the Senate would put up a plebeian to be consul, and he'd be so terrible, the people would never vote for a plebeian for another 100 years. Senate was very smart. And indeed, you can see the Senate, in effect, had enormous power because it initiated legislation. It basically gave the people an all or nothing vote. When the Senate proposed a law, the people could vote against it, but they couldn't come up with their own law. There was no institution for that. Now that is where the tribunes became important, and why they're there almost from the beginning of the Republic. They gave some leadership to the people. The Senate was 300 people, tightly organized. They sort of all went to school together. They all knew each other. They worked together. The people were very disorganized. Having these tribunes was important to give them some kind of political organization. But by and large, over the centuries, the plebeians did defer to the patricians, and Shakespeare shows that in Coriolanus. You could drive them too far, and then they'd exert their power. But basically, they had a great deal of respect in this aristocratic world for these people they thought of as their betters. But that's basically how the patricians ruled for as long as they did. Again, I think Shakespeare shows great awareness of that and how Coriolanus works out. So, roughly, that's the Republican regime. Shakespeare, I think, portrays it as quite remarkable. And again, you can see what is extraordinary about it, that everybody in Rome, even the common people, have some role in the regime, have some say in their political life. They are not passive, not even the common people. And this regime lasted an inordinately long period of time and conquered the world in the process. Something was right about it. And indeed, what Machiavelli suggests, and I think Shakespeare understands, is this regime had a great deal of energy. It was turbulent. It did not look right. It looked jerry-built. It was not designed. It was not stable. The relative power roles of the Senate, the consuls, and the people was not clearly defined. But that, Machiavelli argues, was its strength. That the jostling for power in the regime made it work over time. And in particular, it was designed to make the consuls be great generals. They couldn't be chosen if they weren't great generals, and because they had only 1 year to serve, they went out and tried to conquer something quickly in that time to earn one of these great Roman triumphs. Now, I don't have much time left, so I'm very quickly going to sketch in the problematic of Roman history that Shakespeare then deals with in Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra. This regime lasted a long time, but its one weakness was the position of the consuls, which grew much more powerful in the late days of the Republic. Once Rome had conquered much of the Mediterranean world, when they had armies going to Spain, armies going to Persia, armies going to North Africa, they found they had to prolong the military commands. And this one-year rule was suspended. And generals started to run their armies for 5, 6, 7 years, and that's when their armies developed private loyalties to their generals, where the armies were no longer loyal so much to Rome, but to their own general. Again, if your general changed every year, you were loyal to Rome. But these people like Julius Caesar or his erstwhile colleague Pompey, Marcus Crassus, these were these great consuls who had long military commands in which they developed private loyalties from their soldiers, in which they used the enormous wealth they garnered from conquering places like Egypt and Spain to pay their armies themselves and get their soldiers loyal to them just because they were the ones who were paying the bills. And that's what eventually subverted the Republic. And it's what Shakespeare shows in Julius Caesar. Caesar has just defeated Pompey, the last of his rivals. We can see this summed up. You all know the story of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. What that story is about is that Caesar had this enormous army with which he'd conquered Gaul, and he was bringing it back to the city of Rome. And Rome had nothing in terms of a military force that could equal Caesar's, and the senators knew that, and they told Caesar, you can come to Rome, but you can't bring your army with you. And the rule was you couldn't cross the Rubicon. That was the boundary. Beyond that, no Roman general could bring his army. Well, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it wasn't just Caesar who brought his army with him. The rest is history. He ended up becoming dictator for life in Rome, and that was the end of the Republic, although we see a last-ditch attempt to assassinate him and restore the Republic. But again, Shakespeare seems to understand that logic as well, and shows, again, it's easy. Oh yeah, the Roman Republic was doomed from the start. You know, after a mere 450 years, the regime died. You got to give it some credit, actually, and I think Shakespeare and people like Machiavelli and Polybius do. But anyway, so that the dynamic, the logic of the movement from the Republic to the Empire, I think, is what governs Shakespeare's Roman plays, and we see it worked out when you view them in historical sequence, from Coriolanus dealing with the early days of the Republic, Julius Caesar dealing with the overthrow of the Republic, and Antony Cleopatra dealing with the foundation of the empire. So that's my sense. Shakespeare, the Roman regime, he really did know the history, he really did understand the politics of it, and I think he was portraying it in these plays, and also showing the human consequences, how this change of regime led to a fundamental change in the way of life, so that the world of Antony Cleopatra is just extraordinarily different from the world of Coriolanus. I don't have time to explain that. It is in my book if you want to read that, but I'll pause here and we can take some questions. So, any questions? Yes.
And made it look real sympathetic, especially in comparison to Octavius Caesar.
You know, it's very very complicated. Oh, I'm supposed to repeat the questions. The question is, does Shakespeare prefer Antony to Octavius? I think Shakespeare's mind doesn't work that way. The reason he is a great dramatist is he can always see the two sides of any question, and he can see the good and bad sides of any human being. Personally, I think both Octavius and Antony are distasteful people. I don't like either of them. Octavius is cold-blooded and ruthless and unemotional, but he's a good ruler, and he's a good administrator, and this seems to be fairly true to the historic Octavius. Antony is a great PR man. He makes him sound so infinitely cool, and he's, got this Cleopatra, but he's responsible for the death of thousands of his soldiers. He loses his navy. He ends up making Cleopatra lose Egypt to the Romans. I mean, in a way, ask yourself, whose army would you like to be in, Octavius or Antony? I mean, Antony is a tremendously attractive character if you like playboys. And again, he's given great poetry, but there's a really negative side to Antony in the play. And it's interesting. I tried to lift the whole dialogue about these plays away from the question of Antony versus Octavius to the larger question of Republic versus Empire, because I think actually Shakespeare gives a very negative portrait of the Empire and a relatively positive portrait of the Republic, though even there, I mean, it's characteristic of him that he shows the faults of the Republic, the greatness of the Republic. He shows the faults of the Empire, maybe the greatness of the Empire as well. But I really find it odd that people get all weepy about Antony. Yeah, he dies and it's a tragedy. Yeah, but he's awful. I mean, he just throws away every opportunity. He loses one battle after another, and then says, "Oh, let's have another drink." I mean, if you view him in political terms, I mean, he's just a disaster. So, yes. Yeah. No, it is true that. These are first and foremost great plays, and you got to see them produced. Unfortunately, you got to see them well produced, and there's a tendency of productions now to make the plays worse than they were when you read them. But Titus is a good example where Julie Taymor does just a fantastic job with it, and made me realize it's not a great play, but it's a decent play. And anyway, so yes, they are plays, and Shakespeare's an absolute master of the theater. Guess what? And they're really just brilliantly adapted to the theater, and they play wonderfully, and they're the greatest plays ever written. Nevertheless, there's a lot you can't catch if you're just at the theater, and it does pay off to read them, and you got to read them very carefully, and stuff goes by you too fast on the stage. Though I always notice new things that I didn't catch from reading when I see the plays, often sometimes because of some clever thing that the director has chosen to highlight. But it is, I'll just say that the standard line for centuries has been that Shakespeare wasn't interested in seeing his plays published, and therefore why are we worried about reading them? This has been challenged in a book by a man named Lucas Erne, E-R-N-E, and it's called Shakespeare as Literary Dramatist. It's Cambridge University Press. It's an absolutely brilliant book which tries to prove that Shakespeare did try to get his plays published and was involved in the publication of them. It's a very complicated technical matter, and I won't go into the details, but Erne offers a lot of evidence that Shakespeare was interested in publication, and some of his plays were carefully prepared for him by publication. And it's interesting because Coriolanus and Antony Cleopatra are two of them. And my own personal theory is that he retired when he did, and he retired early, about 6 years before his death. He stops producing plays, and he was an active member of a theater company, a shareholder, and an actor. I believe he retired staging plays in order to prepare a written edition of his plays, and unfortunately died prematurely 6 years later after having prepared a few texts very well. It's interesting, they're rather late plays. The Tempest, Coriolanus, and Antony Cleopatra have the best three texts. frankly, they have virtually unproblematic text. They have stage directions that are authentic and so on. And it looks like we really lost, if Shakespeare had lived 10 more years, we might have had a really accurate edition of all his plays. Now, I can't prove that, but the status of his text varies from complete messes, like Hamlet and King Lear, to some really reasonably very good texts, like Coriolanus and Cleopatra. So I go along with Ern that Shakespeare wasn't just leaving it to chance. And again, the people that did do the first folio were his close friends, Hemmings and Condell, and did their best. Unfortunately, in many cases, they didn't have perfect text to deal with. But Ern is very good at showing the differences between plays where some plays, a character comes in and someone says, "That's a very nice red dress you have on." And as Ern points out, and other plays have nothing like that. As Ern points out, I'm making up the example, but if you were at the theater, no one had to tell you it was a red dress. But he shows you there are plays where things are being described that you wouldn't describe if it were being staged, and that suggests to him that Shakespeare was rewriting the plays for published form and supplying what you would have to do. It's a very subtle argument, but he really works this out in detail. Yes.
He was far more for pagan. Now, with respect to Shakespeare, do you find to any extent that in his wonderful ballads or whatever, he preserves a balance between Christian and pagan, the strong, muscular, fierce pagan, or is there any, do we ever find Machiavelli or even Nietzsche coming through a little?
The epigraphs to Shakespeare's Rome are from Nietzsche. And they are the secret key to the book. It is remarkable the extent to which Machiavelli anticipates Nietzsche in that passage, but Nietzsche was a classical scholar by profession, and he began from study of Greece and Rome. And yes, I think the whole of Shakespeare is his attempt to balance the difference between classicism and Christianity. I've written a book on Hamlet that focuses entirely on that issue, also with an epigraph from Nietzsche. But I'll just tell you, between you and me, nobody else listen, I think Nietzsche is the key to understanding Shakespeare. But don't tell anybody else. Yes.
Doesn't write more about Greek politics, or why when he does it's so strange.
Yeah, that is really very puzzling to me, and it's painful because you wish, and Timon of Athens is just, it's horrible. I mean, this is his view of Athens. It's painful to read, and I don't fully understand that, except to say that we have a different view of the ancient Greeks now because we know so much more about them. And, again, it's in Shakespeare's lifetime that George Chapman starts translating Homer into English. Shakespeare I don't think he even had access to texts of the Greek tragedies. I do see signs that he knew something about Plato and Aristotle. He quotes Plato in Julius Caesar at one point, the Alcibiades I. It's quite extraordinary. And I want to say he must have admired Plato and Aristotle because I think his thinking is very close to theirs, but he doesn't seem to like the Greek politics very much, and that may be that view that you see reflected in the founding fathers of America, of the petty republics of Greece, and this was even, you see in Polybius, what they thought of was Greek cities as disasters. I mean, they didn't last. Here's Rome lasting 450 years. Athens changed regime every 5 years in the 5th century. And plus, of course, when it came to the battlefield, the Romans just wiped up the floor with the Greeks. Yes. Well, again, and I just don't, he just doesn't seem I mean, it's, Spartans are boring. They're too Spartan. There's there's a play the only Elizabethan play I know set in Sparta is John Ford's The Broken Heart. It has nothing really to do with Sparta, but Timon of Athens has Alcibiades in it. That ought to be the most fascinating subject. Shakespeare should have loved Alcibiades. It would have made the most fascinating subject for a play, and he just blows it. I don't understand it. Greece didn't have the reputation it has now then. For example, Shakespeare could have seen Roman ruins in Britain and had a strong sense of the greatness of Rome. No one knew much about the Parthenon then. We have strange ideas about the Greeks. I can't resist sharing this. I saw this special on Robin Hood on the History Channel, correlated with the new movie, and so they're interviewing Russell Crowe, the great historian, and he's talking about the Robin, the movie. I guess he goes to the Holy Land with Richard, Robin Hood in this film. And so Russell Crowe's talking about what a great political thinker Robin Hood was, and all the things he encountered. He was saw the Ottoman Empire, and he experienced democracy in Greece. Russell says, this is Ottoman Empire Greece of the 12th century, whatever, and that's the problem we have, that we have such a great image of Greece, the cradle of democracy, that we think, Greece in the Middle Ages. I didn't even want to say what it was, and that's part of the problem, that we think, Shakespeare must have had this high opinion of the Greek cities. Probably he didn't think that much of them. Maybe he didn't even know that much about Sparta. It's interesting, within Coriolanus has contempt for the Greek democracies there. So I don't know. It troubles me deeply, I have to say. But yes.
And do you think Shakespeare followed Plutarch's view of Julius Caesar and what extent did Plutarch?
Okay, I don't know, forgetting. Yeah, the question is, to what extent did Shakespeare follow Plutarch's view of Julius Caesar? I think he obviously takes a lot of the details but I think Shakespeare probes it more than Plutarch does. I'm not exactly. Could you state for me what you think Plutarch's view of Caesar is? Oh, okay. Because I think, Shakespeare's view of Caesar is of a man at the end of his tether who doesn't know what to do anymore. He's in the process of destroying the very system that gave him honor, this republic. And he just can't figure out. He's conquered everybody. He's gotten every possible honor in Rome. The last thing seems to be to become king, but that would make him live in infamy. And so Shakespeare gives a very complex view of Caesar. He's a man with great weakness, subject to flattery, physically weak. He's deaf in one ear. He has epilepsy, and yet he is so powerful that no one in Rome questions that he is great. The only question is whether he's all that great that everyone else has to fall down and worship him. So I think Shakespeare gets a lot of the details from Plutarch, but what he puts together is a more consistent and more complex figure. But I don't want to underrate Plutarch there. I'd have to really, I've never sat down really and worked out how much of that actually is in Plutarch. Yes?
Going to spell out a little what you meant by saying that Nietzsche is the key, if I heard you correctly, that Nietzsche is the key to interpreting Shakespeare's point of view.
Well, I mean, it's in my book on Hamlet, and it's in my book on the Rome plays, if you want to see it in some greater detail. I mean, basically, what it is, that Shakespeare understands the difference between the ancient world and Christianity in terms of master morality and slave morality, much as Nietzsche presents it. And that's very strong in the contrast between Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra. That Coriolanus is all about the world of masters and slaves. It's an aristocratic world where the fundamental measure of value is strength, and people accept that. It's very interesting that in Antony and Cleopatra, the ethics of losing develops. The great claim of Antony, it's one reason I don't like him so much, is, it's better to lose. Oh, 'tis paltry to be Caesar. I shall have more glory of this losing day. You really see what Nietzsche would call slave morality emerge there, that it's just these stupid old Romans that think it's great to win battles. But it's so much better to lose battles, because then your people will love you. And Antony stages, in fact, a kind of Last Supper in that play in the fourth act, where he gets all his disciples to surround him, and they're all weeping. And so I think it's a very, in fact, Nietzschean understanding of what's going on there. And Hamlet all turns on the contrast between the revenge ethic of the mass morality and the renunciation of revenge in Christianity. On that note, I'd better end.